The Harvard Graduate School of Education, working at the nexus of practice, policy, and research.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for being here on this rainy evening. We didn't know that we would have such a big crowd, and it's wonderful to have you. I'm Kathleen McCartney, Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And there's great music on that is over now, so that's good. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special Askwith Forum featuring Derek and Sissela Bach. I just want to say a word about our Askwith Forums. They are public lectures at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and we showcase leaders who share their knowledge with us, generate spirited conversations, and share their insights. I would encourage you to check our website to find out about upcoming events. This year, both Derek Bach and Sissela Bach published books on happiness. Sissela's book is from the perspective of philosophy and ethics. She asks questions like, what does it mean to be happy? Where does happiness come from? And is all happiness equal from a moral perspective? Derek Bach's book is from the perspective of politics and policy. Can and should human happiness be a driver in shaping social policy? Will a government that systematically emphasizes policy that causes human happiness win the support of its people? We're so fortunate to have them here tonight, and I know that Howard will have more to say in his introduction. But really, my job is to welcome you and to introduce my colleague, Howard Gardner. Howard began his career at Harvard in 1961, and he's never left, so he has good taste. Howard was an undergraduate here, and he was the first in his family to attend college. He was then a graduate student here in developmental psychology, and he is now the John H. and Elizabeth A. Hobbs Professor of Cognition and Education. He's also a senior director at Harvard Project Zero. Howard is the author of more than 20 books, including his groundbreaking work on multiple intelligences. Howard is an apt moderator for this evening's program, as so much of his work takes into consideration the question of motivation, and what better motivator than happiness. I'm looking forward to hearing from the Bachs as well as Howard. Please join me in welcoming Howard Gardner.
Thanks, Kathy, and good evening, everyone. It's a special, I would say unique honor to be able to introduce and share the evening with Sissela and Derek Bach. Kathy's already revealed how long I've been here, and so have they. And it's wonderful to have them as colleagues and friends for many years. And as they know, but probably nobody else knows, as landlords on Prentice Lane a long time ago. Derek and Sissela met in Europe in the early 1950s. They've been married for 55 years, have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. At Harvard, where we are, everybody is brilliant and distinguished. But in this case, we're dealing with 2 people who genuinely deserve those descriptors. And if you were to go to my bookshelf at home, you'd see that it's happily filled with books by Derek and books by Sissela. As Kathy said, Sissela is a renowned philosopher, and a philosopher in the good old ample sense of the term philosopher. She's a renowned author as well, and she writes about big and important questions. And as I think about her books, it is not only the titles, but the very specific way in which she looks at those topics, which is very memorable. She's written, and those of you who know the books will instantly have images in your mind about lying, secrets, mayhem, and now exploring happiness. Derek is part of the history of our era. He's generally considered to be the best Harvard president in recent memory, and I think he's the best university president of the second half of the last century. And he will disagree, but
Yeah, who are you thinking about in the first half?
I knew he would disagree. And because Derek was such a wonderful president in the 70s and 80s, when we ran into a little trouble here a few years ago, he came back on campus, he restored calm, and I think people close to the situation know he was the best person to do that. Derek is by training a lawyer. He was the dean of the law school. He's the author of a shelf of influential books. Again, the memories will come back to those of you who know The Cost of Talent, Trouble with Government, The Trouble with Government, Shape of the River with Bill Bowen, recently, Our Underachieving Colleges, other books on higher education, and I gather another one on the way, and of course, most recently, The Politics of Happiness. I teach a course on good work, and some of the students from that course are here this evening, and in that course, we study what it means to be a good person, a good worker, and a good citizen. And so students always ask, well, could you be one and not the other? And alas, the answer is yes. There are people who are good workers but not good citizens, etc. But in this particular case, we have in front of us two individuals who, without doubt, epitomize all three of those goods. So please join me in welcoming this evening two good persons, good workers, good citizens, Sissela and Derek Bach.
Thank you. Thank you.
Am I audible? Okay, good. So the ground rules this evening are going to be simple and informal. We'll talk about the two books, how each of the authors came to write them, what they think are the most important ideas, and perhaps particularly the ones that surprised you in writing the books. Then I'd like to talk a bit about how each of you go about writing and how you go about interacting, particularly when, as happened to be in this case, you were writing books for some time on the same topic. Also, because we're at the Graduate School of Education, any education insights along the way would be appreciated. And at the end, I'll probably ask you directly whether at any level, from young children all the way to those of us who have stayed in the university for a long time, some of the ideas which you developed in the book might be something that we would want to know about. And then we will open it up to questions, and Derek and Sissela have agreed to answer questions that are on your mind, though there is one proviso: we don't discuss current Harvard politics, and I think that, or policies, I think that would be an understandable topic for another evening. So Sissela, did you know for a long time that you were going to write about happiness, or did it emerge one happy evening?
Well, you know, for the longest time, I have been interested certainly in the topic of happiness, but I really didn't think one could write about it from a philosophical point of view, the kind that I wanted to have, namely both practical and theoretical. And I remember when long ago, Derek would come home with all kinds of statistics about people who were happier or less happy depending on what level of education they had had, and happier or less happy men and women, all kinds of comparisons. And at that time, I was studying philosophy, and I said, this is ridiculous. How can you possibly take a subject as complicated and as deep as this and have statistics about it? And then, during the 90s, we both became aware of the sort of the social science research that was coming to be very much coming into evidence. And I remember at one point Derek came and had some statistics about Sweden, where I come from, being one of the happiest countries by this kind of research that goes on in all the different countries now. And I was amazed. thinking of some grumpy Swedes that I know. And then I decided to look more into it, and of course finding what matters in different countries, like, for instance, having a government that you feel trust for, and having respect for human rights, and so many other aspects that are more important than the climate or how grumpy you may or may not be. So anyway, I paid more and more attention and began to think I probably would write about it. At that point, and you'll find out Derek was not. Derek was writing about a lot of other things. But it's taken me a long time, and I have wanted to follow the research in the social sciences, in the brain sciences, and very much also bring that together with philosophy, theology, the arts, autobiography. That matters very much to me. And so my aim really was to try to bring all of those perspectives together. And that just shows me how wrong I was in the beginning when I said, how can you possibly take a subject like this and try to write about it?
What was the biggest stretch for you as you looked at these different bodies of commentary and research and so on in trying to formulate your views of happiness?
Well, a very big stretch, and to some extent a surprising one for me, was that there seemed to be quite a few books in philosophy, for instance, and in theology, but they had almost no interest in the social sciences, much less the natural sciences. That's been changing over the last few years. In the same way, lots of social science books, brain science books, might mention a philosopher like Aristotle, but that was about all. And I just felt that the stretch for me then was to try to bring these together and show how much they could actually learn from one another, and then also to show how the ethical questions that arise for anyone thinking about their own happiness and what it might be doing to other people's happiness, to bring those to the forefront, because on the whole, they were not in the forefront in any of these fields.
Well, say a bit more about that, because I mean, I've read the book, so I have a sense of the issue, but what is the tension between happiness and ethics, as you would formulate it?
Well, there's been a discussion from the beginning almost about whether people who are happy are therefore more virtuous, better human beings, or whether those two things are somehow separate. And for a long time in antiquity, it was thought that happiness and being a good person went together. And then came someone like Immanuel Kant, for instance, and said, look, just look around. There are quite a few happy people who are actually not very good, and the reverse is also true. And that he would argue the most important thing is to be worthy of being happy, even if it turns out that your life may be miserable as a result. So that debate has been going on, and right now in so many self-help books, for instance, the idea is if you just become happier, well, it's probably quite natural you will also be a nicer person. That is not so clear. And even if you think that you are a nicer person and that makes you happy, it might not be true. That's another thing.
Let me ask you one other question. You have the privilege, you have the talent that most of us don't have of knowing several languages. Does happy translate easily across those languages, or might it have a somewhat different connotation? I mean, I think perhaps that happiness might be more self-indulgent in this country than say, in Scandinavia, but I don't know any Scandinavian languages. So do you think the connotations may be different, or does it translate pretty well, let's say, across Europe and the United States?
Well, that's such an interesting question, because there are a number of words in different languages, and it's not that I know them all, but there are marvelous books comparing all these languages. And indeed, some of the words, like the German Glücklichkeit or the French Bonheur, for instance, have a lot to do with something good that happens to you, good fortune. Greek eutychia also. Others are quite different. And there, when I was writing a chapter about defining happiness, I wanted to argue that there are such different conceptions of happiness. I don't think it's particularly American in Europe or anything. Different conceptions depending on whether you're talking about a moment of happiness or bliss or a longer period. And in the social science research that's done, of course, people also ask very different questions. They ask, one question is, how do you feel about your life as a whole? Do you think, on the whole, it is a happy one? Very different kind of question is, how many times of being happy and unhappy did you have yesterday, for instance, or are you having right now? And that is entirely different, and I think the various languages can deal with that. I also think, when we think of education, children from the beginning know a lot of things, and they learn a lot of things. When they hear that the couple married and lived happily ever after, they know what that means. When they see a smiling face, they know that may be a happy face. At the same time, they gradually learn about all the undercurrents. That smiley face may not indeed reveal so much happiness. So I think children have a way of understanding some things from the beginning, and then, if they are lucky, if they have a background where this is made possible, they can learn to draw all kinds of distinctions and understand other people's and their own happiness in much subtler ways.
Well, you're giving a very good sample for all of us here about how deftly you're able to draw on this range of sources. I think one review said they didn't see how in 200 pages you could cover so much ground, and you've already covered a lot of ground in 10 minutes. Thank you. Derek, Sissela said that you weren't writing a book at the time that she first had the idea. How far back? Well, I guess you showed up with statistics for a long time. When did this change from a dinner table gambit to a magnum opus?
Well, I got interested, I suppose, back maybe in the late 60s. I was just intrigued by exploring a subject as subjective as happiness in a kind of social science kind of way. But as you pointed out in your introduction, I got sort of waylaid into what I've always referred to as the trackless void of academic administration, and which kept me away from writing serious books for some 25 years. When I returned, sort of like Rip Van Winkle, I awoke to find that this subject had really taken off, and that there were over 1,000 empirical studies of happiness. But at that point, I had some other books that I'd committed to write, and anyway, Sissela had now learned that the Swedes were a consensus pick as the happiest country in the world, which, as she indicated, electrified her interest in the subject. And so I didn't feel that was something that I could do. And it wasn't until, I guess, maybe somewhere around 2003 that she decided that she was writing a book about happiness, but really didn't want to cover the kind of policy side of it. So that gave me a little opening, because I noticed that in all these empirical studies, there really wasn't much about what the implications for government were. So as the great Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall once said, I seed my opportunity and I took it.
You start the book with a vignette about Bhutan.
Yes.
And I'm not sure I would have known about it if I hadn't heard you talk about it. But could you tell us a bit both about what's happening, what happened there, and have you been able to track whether the plan they have has materialized?
Well, yes, and I have tracked it largely because I drew upon the treasure chest of Harvard, which is that you can find somebody at Harvard who's done almost anything. And so sure enough, I ran across a graduate student at the Kennedy School who'd spent the preceding summer working in Bhutan and in connection with some of the government efforts along this line. So I really had a wonderful insight, and he did some further research for me. But Bhutan is a fascinating story that you don't hear much about. You don't hear much about Bhutan, for that matter. I mean, it's wedged between China and India, way up in the Himalayas, very beautiful, but almost inaccessible country. But in 1972, something amazing happened. They had a king, a much beloved king, by the name of Wanchuk. I don't know, of course, whether that was his first name or his last name. It's the one that appears at the end of the sentence. But he was the one who, out of the blue, announced, he was Western educated, he thought about these things, he announced that from here on, the central primary objective of what the government did in Bhutan would not be a gross national product, but the gross national happiness. And he was very serious about this. One of the first things he realized, which I think is almost unprecedented in history, he came to the conclusion that if you really wanted to make happiness the goal of the country, not just for a few moments while he was there, but for a long period of time, the best guarantee of that was a democracy. Of course, monarchy has never solved the problem of succession, so you couldn't be sure that his grandchildren or whatever, whoever would take over would be able to adhere to this conscientiously. His big problem was that the people did not want a democracy because they were very happy with him. And he didn't believe, he wasn't an autocrat, he didn't believe in shoving something down people's throats. So it took about 30 years, but lo and behold, he kept chipping away and adding a feature of democracy here and one there. And finally, in 2008, they had a new constitution. They had their first election for an independent legislature. They had an independent judiciary. And the democracy is in full cry. And they have gone about it very systematically. They have drawn up a large list of indicators, of ways of measuring happiness. They've done a whole number of things in education and free medical care, and environmental measures of various kinds to maintain the beauty of the land, to try to maintain a healthy balance between work and recreation and family life. And sure enough, the infant mortality has gone way down, literacy has gone way up, the quality of government has improved, and the people's happiness, at least, you have to be a little skeptical because some of these, many of the villages are only accessible by, I don't know, mountain goat. And so you kind of wonder how systematic are these polls. But it is said that the gross national happiness has indeed climbed substantially higher than, say, in China and India. Their government is rated by the World Bank better than any of its surrounding neighbors. They haven't been totally successful. They haven't been very nice to the Nepalese minority, for example, but that's another story. But on the whole, it's a remarkable story of a visionary who believed sufficiently in an ideal for government and for the happiness of his people that he was willing to give up power and work quite tenaciously against the will of the people to install a whole set of regime that I think he quite rightly felt would guarantee a much longer lived happiness. Because one of the things that comes across from the research is that if you look at all of the happiest countries in the world, they have all been successful democracies for well over 50 years. And so clearly there is something to having a good, efficient, trustworthy, democratic government if you want to achieve the happiness of your people.
I do wonder, though, they both Sweden and Bhutan have monarchs, too.
Yes, yes.
And I'm sure if you did a poll of happiness in America today, it would be very, very low. It might be possible that monarchs play some kind of a counterbalance to the politicos whom you can kick out, but you still have just a hypothesis. My wife and I often joke that the French are only happy when they're unhappy. Yes. And of course they got rid of their monarchs.
Yes, the hard way.
In the bloodiest way. Well, Derek, you know the data, as they say, about happiness extremely well. I don't know if you've read all 1,000 studies, but you probably read a good many of them.
There were 2 or 3 that are out of print.
For those of us here who haven't master that literature, what do you think we would find most surprising if we were to,
Well, you'd
encounter it?
find a lot of little nuggets of no particular transcending importance that probably would surprise you. I mean, it surprised me to learn that actors and actresses who had won an Oscar, if you compared them with other actors and actresses who had been nominated for an Oscar but had not won, it surprised me to learn that the Oscar winners lived several years longer as well as being happier. Now, I don't immediately see an explanation for that, but perhaps not being an actor, I don't realize how important winning an Oscar can be to your life. Another thing that surprised me that is a little bit more relevant to the kinds of things we think about in the School of Education, there's a marvelous study of that was done at Harvard, where they interviewed at length a large number of Harvard seniors, and then checked up on them 30 years after they had graduated. And they found that the ones who said that they had a very warm and happy family life growing up, if you compared with the one who said their parents were cold or distant or conflictual or so forth, that the ones who had the warm and happy life had many fewer serious illnesses in the ensuing 30 years. That I wouldn't have necessarily expected either. But if I had to make a broader statement and say what sort of overall kind of conclusion emerges from this research that I won't say I was surprised at, but I really would not have known it in advance, really relates to something that Sissela mentioned. And that is that although it's true there are happy people who are scoundrels and there are unhappy people who are very virtuous, on the whole, the things that happy people do and the things that make you happy tend to be things that are kind of good for society and good for other people. In other words, happiness is not a zero-sum game where you get more happiness by tramping on or ignoring or being callous about other people.
Well, some do, of course. This is where we
sure.
have our little discussion.
Very important point. All this research deals in terms of tendencies and averages and is certainly not infallible. I mean, one of the things that comes across, it's by no means clear that having children makes you any happier. But that's an average, and obviously there are all kinds of people who could not understand what their life would have been like had they not had children. So that's true. But on the whole, looking at it in terms of tendencies, correlations, averages, that the kinds of things that make you happier, having strong marriages, having close friends, being civically active in your community, doing senseless acts of kindness and gratitude toward other people.
By senseless, you mean without expecting a reward, right?
Yes. All of those things tend to make you happier, and that, of course, is one of the reasons why there is a connection with public policy, because if making people happy strengthens instincts that are good for society, that's worth doing. That's another reason, at least, for making it worth promoting.
I mean, I was surprised in the book that being on the lower economic side of the scales was not a bigger factor in people being unhappy. That the notion that many of us have that somehow bringing about a more economically equitable society would be an important factor. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. Now, it is true that in just about every country that you look, people who have higher incomes are happier than people who have lower incomes. There are exceptions. There are quite a lot of unhappy rich people, and there are quite a lot of happy poor people, but on the whole, there's a real difference. There's also a difference between countries. Countries that are among the well-to-do, prosperous countries of the world are uniformly happier on average than countries that are poor. But you mentioned inequality, and America is quite an unequal society in terms of income, and it's been getting a good deal less equal ever since the 1970s. So the question that the researchers asked is, did increasing inequality make people less happy? And what they found was yes in Europe, no in the United States. People were not less happy. There was only one group that they could identify in the United States who were less happy because the society became less equal, and that were well-to-do liberals. But the poor people themselves...
We wouldn't know any of those.
And that was not so surprising to me, because it really has roots in something that's been troubling researchers for ages in America. Why has there been no socialist movement? Why have unions had so much trouble getting started? Lots of the very detailed studies of people who are working in very low-income jobs find that they feel, I'm probably not doing well because I haven't worked hard, or because I was not as smart. But so they don't begrudge high incomes the way you would find in Europe. So that's a very marked, there are a lot of things, there are many more similarities between, say, Europe and the United States than there are differences, but this is one of the very marked differences.
Sissela, back to you, if I may. One of the parts of the book which I hadn't expected at all, and so it was a special treat, was your delving into how two people who were roughly contemporary thought about happiness in society, Freud and Bertrand Russell. Freud, of course, was the founding psychoanalyst who laid bare unconscious processes, and Bertrand Russell, who lived forever, was a philosopher, very much interested in politics and policy as he got older. In some ways similar to Noam Chomsky, in that he was a big political voice as well as an important thinker in the academy. And can you tell us a bit about how they thought about happiness and what you think about what they thought about it?
Well, I was so interested that in 1930, both of them came out with books. Freud's so well-known Civilization and Its Discontent, and Bertrand Russell, also very known and still sold in bookstores, etc., The Conquest of Happiness. And there were these two people, and one thing that I do, it's a little different from what Derek does, I get very interested in the people themselves and their stories and their lives and everything. So there they were. Freud was older, but this was in 1930. Germany was foundering, as he could see, into total disaster, and certainly life was miserable. He himself had cancer of the throat and was in a great deal of pain. But anyway, he, in his book, which had so many other things to say for which it is still well known, he also did say that it was not meant for human beings to try to find lasting happiness. That just wasn't possible. There were three really great difficulties for human beings. First of all, it was other people. Secondly, it was your own body, unfortunately. You're getting older and older. And third, and I now forget what the third was, and Bertrand Russell, on the other hand, did say that he did think it was possible. Now, both of those, as I talk about in the chapter, they were in circumstances of depression, both of them. Bertrand Russell's marriage, second marriage, was falling apart. He and his wife had both written that it ought to be possible to have open affairs, lovers come and live in the house when you were married, and that hadn't worked out very well at all. So anyway, here were these two.
She enjoyed it. It was just he who found
Well,
it trying.
Yeah. So here were these two. These two amazing people, really, so brilliant, and had so much to say, who disagreed completely on that subject of whether it was possible to find lasting happiness. Russell thought it was possible, Freud on the whole did not. There were many other similarities and differences. I think they both were geniuses. They had both been nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature, which Bertrand Russell won and Freud did not win. And he'd also been nominated for medicine.
So Derek can explain this now, right? The Nobel Prize being the
Yes.
academic
Died
equivalent
earlier,
of the
Very interesting point. I hadn't thought of that, yes. So that was, and then what I wanted to do in that chapter was, first of all, to lay out their stories, their accounts, why they had such very different views, and then secondly, to ask, what does contemporary science have to say about their views? Now, one view which they shared was that most people are, on the whole, quite unhappy. Freud thought that was just bound to continue. Russell thought you could change it. Turns out, contemporary science, and as Derek has pointed out, yes, that's not true. Both of them were wrong on that score, we now know. However, with respect to being able to become happier, there's so much interesting research, and I probably shouldn't go into that here, but it is fascinating to see that social science would weigh down more on the side of Bertrand Russell on that score, instead of saying that we are just bound to be unable to ever gain lasting happiness.
Do you have a view about positive psychology?
Positive psychology, well, I've certainly read a lot, and of course there are so many different views. I do have a view, I think there's a real contribution from Martin Seligman and other people who are not in positive psychology, but Ed Diener, other people in the forefront of research on subjective well-being, which is what they call it, namely the subjective sense of happiness. And they would all argue that there is more you can do. Yes, there is heredity to be dealt with, and yes, there are the genes, and yes, there is so-called hedonic treadmill, which means that you often adapt, unfortunately, to circumstances so that you don't get happier when, for instance, you have some more money, or when you have a new car, or anything else happens good in your life, or something bad in your life. You adapt to that too. But these psychologists would all argue that there's various things you can do. I think Derek mentioned perhaps this notion of gratitude, remembering sometimes what you have to be grateful for, doing things that you might not otherwise think of doing. And Sonia Lyubomirsky, I should have mentioned her book also, The How of Happiness, argues that we can try to go against this adaptation, the treadmill, by really becoming quite intentional about certain things that we want to care about a lot more, mindfulness. And I also think that, I agree with her, that there are certain kinds of experiences that it's harder to adapt to. And one has to do with other human beings, for better or for worse. Another has to do with beauty, natural beauty, for instance, or works of art. And then it's very important to learn to focus on those in ways that can shape one's experience and increase one's happiness.
Let me ask you about one more thing, thinking back to some of your other writing, for example, Mayhem, and that is what role, and let's talk about the United States because it's most familiar to us, what role do the media play in either holding out the possibility of happiness, or one could argue making it seem something you can't get because of, as you say, all the, the beauty and possessions which are held up as things you should want to have?
Well, I think American children in particular have to learn from the beginning, they don't always, but they have to learn to live with the fact that the advertising world is constantly giving messages of happiness. And they have to learn to be quite skeptical. They don't always learn, as I'm sure everybody knows, but they have to try to learn to be skeptical. At the same time, they're also surrounded by messages of tremendous violence, and of course video games and everything else can have, I think, a strong impact on them. So My view of children is, which I take from psychologists like Jerome Kagan and others, that children start out with the capacity, even by age 2, 3, 4, for empathy and concern for other children, other people, and that can either be fostered or it can be eroded and worn down by the messages that come from the culture.
And that's, of course, something which the earlier writers on happiness could not possibly have been aware of. I mean,
Exactly,
Kant
yes.
did not go to Facebook or have 24/7 coverage.
Not even Freud or Bertrand Russell, yes, this is completely new.
I wanted to talk a bit about writing books. Derek, you have a shelf of books, and I remember that you actually wrote a kind of a short book every year when you were president, and some of us looked forward to it, and some of us dreaded it, depending on what the topic was for the year. So you didn't exactly hang up your pencil during that time. But could you talk a bit about, once you get an idea for a book, how do you go about going from there to a completed manuscript?
Well, I begin, I guess, by reading everything that I can, and then I take out the yellow pad and I begin to make outlines. And I make outlines and then I let them sit for a while. I go back, I look at the outline again and find I can't believe that I did it that way. So I redo the outline. Eventually, I get a sense of how it ought to proceed, and then I begin to write text on the yellow pad. And then I go through probably, I don't know, 20 different drafts. I mean, I never get it right the first time. Then I show it to Sissela. More drafts are required. And eventually it comes out the other way, the other end. But it's a very slow process, and you keep discovering things that you don't know as well as you thought, and having to go back and do research. So it's a kind of, you have to do a lot of research at the beginning, but then it's a kind of iterative process. You write, and then you read more, you think more, you write again, you revise, then you come across things you really need to study harder, or even go back and read books that you now see you should have read with slightly different questions in mind, and you review those again. It's a very, if I didn't love it so much, I would find it really quite tedious.
I sent off a book literally an hour before we came down here, and I remarked to Kirsten, my assistant, something from the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who said there are only 3 happy moments, he probably used the word happy, with a book: when you get the idea, when you send it off to the publisher, and when you get it tangibly. But I added that, of course, that's a great story, but you wouldn't do it, and you certainly wouldn't do it repeatedly. Yeah. But I think the frustrations are part of the pleasure. Mm-hmm. If it were seamless, then it wouldn't be be the same kind of experience. Other than Sissela, are there people whom you regularly show your writing to, or is that more catch as catch can?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say there are some people who I have burdened with looking at things more than once, but by and large, Harvard is such a wonderful place for that, and I think there's a strong sense of collegial responsibility, and I've never had somebody say, no, I'm really not interested in reading a chapter. So I do find that really good critics are hard to find, that some of the people who are, that they're your very good friends, they want to give you as much help as possible. They just don't come up with that much. There are other people, often not as successful perhaps as researchers, but they are just wonderful at tearing what you do into pieces and leaving you in a state of emotional despair. But then you pick yourself up and you're very grateful. Much better to have these things come out before the book is published. And of course, there are just so many people. There isn't a possible subject that I could ever write about that there aren't a variety of people who can offer wonderful insights here at Harvard. And one good thing about academic administration is that you know so many of them just from having sat on their tenure committee and turned down their request for a salary increase. That you have no end of people that you could turn to on personal terms and have them willingly read your stuff.
One more question on this, Derek. Are there complete or incomplete Bach manuscripts that you've chosen not to publish? Are there books that are started in a file cabinet?
I've gotten a certain way into a book and realized that I just don't have the intellectual equipment. I don't mean that just in terms of IQ, although maybe that too, but it requires a kind of technical facility with statistics or some other field that I just don't think I have enough to really do justice to the subject. So I've sort of given it up before I've gotten seriously into it. But no, everything I've got a manuscript to show I have put into print, starting from the age 8 when I wrote a really perfectly stunning, insightful book about the Pilgrims in America. One copy of which still remains. Actually, it's the only copy that was ever made. We didn't even send it out to a publishing house, but I enjoyed it, and it got me started on something I never quite got out of.
It's funny, if you had asked me that question at various points in my life, I might not have remembered some of the enterprises that I started and put away. And it's been
Yes, one does
kind of a
suppress them.
Proustian
Yes. I'm
triggers.
sure there are a lot of manuscripts, but I've forgotten them long since.
How about you, Sissela? Is your story like Derek's, or is it quite different?
I think it is quite different, although we have one thing in common. We started very early, we were always writing in a way. And what interested me was very much also poetry and translating poetry. I went to Geneva at the age of 12, and I studied in an international school. I was on the French side, doing everything in French, and on the English side, in English. And of course, I was Swedish. This took a little nervousness on my part. But what about writing, and I've been thinking about that, on the French side, I had a remarkable teacher once, Mademoiselle Hersch, Jeanne Hersch, who then became a well-known, she probably was already a philosopher, and I didn't know that. But she wanted you to do a typical French, very crisp thing with 3 parts, and every part had 3 parts: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And she was very, very critical, and we read Voltaire, Diderot, Racine, all kinds of things, and that was one experience. On the other, on the English side, I had this wonderful Miss Jones, who loved poetry, loved English literature, taught us Shakespeare, Milton, especially the Romantic poets. And we had to write very different essays, and for the so-called Oxford Higher School certificate, which I ended up taking, namely flowing essays with wonderful quotations and supposed wonderful insights. And those 2 ways of doing things were so different. And sometimes I would translate to some of my friends who didn't speak the other language. I would try. Translation has always mattered so much to me. So in writing then, starting, I was doing dissertation here at Harvard, and then working on various books. I leave various things to the side, and sometimes they come back later on. And I don't do it in the wonderful planned way. I always try to be more with Derek, with the aim and the outline. And he rightly says, when he sees my drafts, he rightly says, "What's the outline here?" That's good. But then I can rightly also ask him some questions coming from the other side. And I guess this particular book, I very much wanted to call it Exploring Happiness. My editor said, "Why don't we just call it Happiness? Semicolon, or happiness colon something else." And I looked it up on, I think, Amazon.com. I could tell her there were 40 other books called Happiness. But exploring for me had to do with metaphor. And metaphor, by the way, along with human lives, matters probably more in my writing than in Derek's. So the metaphor here was of someone setting out to find their fortune or to find their happiness. It can be a young person in a fairy tale or a myth. And in starting this book, I was setting out not so much to find my happiness, but really to explore and understand what happiness was all about, what people had said about it, and what conclusions one could draw. And therefore, for me, there is more meandering, there is more setting aside of things, picking things up again. But in the long run, one can pull things together. And as far as I'm concerned, on this particular subject, the fact that we could show each other drafts and trade back and forth and show all these articles and books and discuss them was hugely helpful.
Great.
The one thing that didn't work was when we once tried to write both together to write an article. And
Awful, awful.
Well, tell us more. Was this Freud or was this Russell?
No, it wasn't part of these books. It was
Yeah.
long before.
And Sissela Sissela's kept a diary since she was 14, and which is enormously useful. It's really quite shocking how your memory gets things mixed up, and she can go back into her diary and say exactly what year and who said what. But she was looking at a diary during this period. She looked at a page where she said, I went down and told Derek I'd spent 2 hours this morning trying to breathe life into this lifeless dog.
Can we ask what it was about?
It was about ethics, actually perhaps the teaching of ethics, and
Can
it
you
came
teach
out
ethics?
under Derek's name. And he finished it. He did a
Reprinted
good
in
job.
numerous anthologies, despite being much maligned by an ungrateful wife. Yes.
I'd like to ask about two more topics and then open it up for questions. So there are some mics here. You may be thinking about whether you want to pose a question or make a comment. One is that you do come from very different disciplinary backgrounds. I mean, law and public policy in Derek's case, and philosophy and the humanities in your case, Sissela. You both are incredibly well read, and you read very widely. So in a sense, it isn't like one of you only stays in the law library and the other one only stays in the humanities library. But I am interested in where are the places where you feel your thinking really complements one another? Where is it similar, and where is it really quite different? I mean, we have this one example, but I assume that it doesn't have to come from that. But just where do we were talking about it before, your professional deformation, as the French say. How does that figure in your intellectual lives together?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. You know, I started out in psychology and got a master's degree in that, and then went into philosophy. But even when I did, I always wanted to make philosophy something, to use the word of Samuel Johnson, put it to the use of life. I wanted it to be practical in some way. So if I wrote about lying, I really did want to consult lawyers, doctors, people in business, parents, children, nurses, so many other people. So I've always tried actually to come from the humanities, but I've been very fortunate often to be in groups, in classes, with people from lots of other backgrounds. And so Derek's background, first the legal, but very much also, after all, his is quite interdisciplinary because of everything he's had to do. So I'm not sure there are such huge differences. Would you say, Derek?
Oh, yes.
I don't know what that "oh yes" meant.
Yeah, you
No,
can.
there are differences. I mean, I do read broadly, but it's aside from things like novels and things I read for pleasure, it's very largely sort of broadly in the social sciences. And when Sissela talks about broadly, I mean it's into poetry and literature and philosophy and psychology. It's a much more sort of imaginative and kind of intellectual background, and that's very helpful for me. I think I might do something for her in the sense that, you know, the law does teach you to try to be very clear. It teaches you to really think about the arguments on the other side of whatever issue you're discussing. I think that's helpful in an age where so many people don't seem to be listening to one another. But it can be pretty dry and kind of I am definitely a linear thinker to a fault, whereas Sisselas sees all sorts of imaginative byways and similarities and contrasts, and her mind takes in more, and that's been a great asset in to me. I've gotten onto ideas and subjects and readings that I just never would have stumbled across on my own, just because she has this quite different set of interests.
When Sissela said earlier that she becomes interested in the people that she writes about, and I would also propose that when I read your writing, I have much more a sense, not necessarily of Kant's personality, but of kind of big monuments, Kant, Aristotle, you mentioned the French philosophers, but also humanists, and it seems to be that's sort of in the background. With Derek, I haven't read the legal things, but it does seem to me to be not only more empirical, but more about the deductions that you can and can't make from a certain set of precepts and from a certain set of findings. I mean, I have the privilege of being on a board with Derek. He's about to kick me off, but we've been on together for a long time. And it is kind of thinking through every angle of the issue without that much attention to who might have had the ideas and what their history is.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's actually a very good point, because the way I think of these people, at least some, I do think of myself as in dialogue with them in some way. I want to know what they think about something. For instance, Iris Murdoch is a person I think is very important. William James, I think of those two as free spirits in their own fields. And I am very interested in learning more about each of them and about others, so that when I take up a person, here, for example, when Descartes was having a correspondence with the Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, little did I know anything about her, but I became really interested in her, and now I feel, yes, I'd like to know much more about her and be in dialogue in some way.
And you can read about it in the book.
Yes.
Okay, last question before we open it up. We are in a school of education, and we have people here who are concerned with the education of young children. We have people here who are interested in educational policy, how young people should be formed. We have people here who work in higher administration. Any messages for any of those audiences here that coming out of the work on happiness that you'd want to?
Well, I'll let Derek answer that, but I'll just mention one thing. We both come from families where both our mothers started schools, actually. My mother in Sweden started a school for nursery school teachers. There was no such thing at all in Sweden at the time.
This would have been...
So
when?
This was in the 1930s. And we would go to visit, the children, we'd come to this school, very simple, but there were wonderful toys, wonderful books, etc., that they were teaching the nursery school teachers to use. And then my mother started something called OMEP, the World Organization of Primary Education, which still functions. Now, Derek's mother, and you should say the one that she started, Mequon School outside of Philadelphia, helped start with another young mother. That still functions too. So we started with families that really cared about education. But then, Derek, you should talk about what your book says.
Well, I think if I had to start with one very broad generalization, I think one thing that happiness research teaches you about educational policy is that those people who make educational policy in this country are way too fixated on developing human capital and preparing a workforce for the 21st century. And yes, that has a place, and you need to earn money, and you spend a great part of your life doing that, and that certainly relates in indirect ways to happiness. But this whole emphasis on growth, I mean, there's a lot of evidence to the effect that America is no happier today than it was in 1948, despite the fact that the gross national product has doubled and redoubled within that time. And that is not wholly clear. There's other evidence that suggests that income does, greater income does increase happiness, but it's very much in doubt. And there's a lot of evidence to the effect that even if economic growth increases happiness, a lot of other things are at least collectively more important. And when you see all this emphasis on kind of skills for the workplace, and sometimes at the expense of things that the research says give people more pleasure, more lasting happiness, things like art and music and actually civic education and civic involvement is strongly correlated with happiness. And then and then of course exercise, sports, athletic pursuits, not football and basketball, which are very hard to enjoy after you leave college, but which get the bulk of resources for athletics, but things like running and tennis and hiking and swimming that you can do with pleasure all your life and make an enormous difference to your health and happiness. Those should get a lot more emphasis. So I would be much more in favor of a very well-rounded education than the policy people are. I think two other things I would do, particularly at the college level. I don't think I would want to have courses about happiness taught in schools. I don't think most teachers are really able to teach. They don't know enough, I think, to teach about happiness, and the field lends itself to all sorts of half-baked ideas, and there are all sorts of books which are quite misleading and not very helpful on the subject. So a certain amount of mischief might be done if you really tried to mandate courses on happiness at the school level. But certainly in college, one could do that, and certainly in college, I think one could do a better job of trying to really inform people about different professions, different vocations, different callings, and what we know about the effect they have on happiness now. I think Howard would agree. He's written a lot of very, very good things on the whole relationship of satisfaction in life to the profession or vocation you follow. And I think making students more aware of that, and not just where can you get the jobs and what education do you need and how much do they pay, and in professional schools too, there are still further vocational choices about what kind of specialty you are going to follow. And there are lots of differences, and a lot of the findings are counterintuitive. If you look at the most satisfying professions, the professions that have the happiest people, the professions that give the greatest satisfaction, it is not exactly the list you would expect, which suggests there's a good deal about achieving happiness through work, which you don't get to naturally, and which I think you should be informed about. And finally, and this is the fuzziest one of all, I always felt in professional school that there were a lot of students, not all students, so some students are just, they know what they want to do and they just give me the facts and give me the skills and let me get out there and get the best job I can. But I think there are a lot of students who we should really respect deeply, who are very interested in trying to figure out, amid all this professional education that they're getting, how, if I can borrow a phrase from one of the most distinguished Harvard alumni who became a lawyer, Oliver Wendell Holmes, how can they live greatly in the law or in education or in business? Something much more than making a lot of money. How can you achieve a real sense of self-worth and fulfillment in a profession? And how you teach that is not easy. I don't know any professional school that I'm not up to date on the School of Education, so please accept that. But I certainly don't know the professional schools that I am more in touch with. I don't get a sense that this is on the radar screen at all. I think most professors would say, that's not what I was hired to do. I'm not sure I know how to be totally fulfilled in my own profession. How can I teach other people? But, you know, one can read biographies, one can read a certain amount of empirical research on the subject. One can, one of the things I think was most imaginative, and that I think it was taught in this school and in several other professional schools, was a course that Bob Coles used to give, which I thought had a wonderful idea. He said, people are going to be very shy talking about how they might achieve fulfillment in the profession. So what I'll do is we'll assign works of fiction about that profession that illustrate the kinds of human problems and human dilemmas that people encounter in whether he taught it about the law, if he was in the law school, about doctors, if he was teaching it in the medical school. He taught it in several professional schools. And of course, people would be very shy about talking about themselves, become very animated in talking about the characters in a short story or in a novel. And I know for the students who took that, it made a lasting impression on them, and he was often in correspondence with students who had taken this years before and who kept coming back to it in their mind as they encountered different problems in their profession. But I always felt we really cared about happiness. I mean, we would somehow factor that into perhaps not a required course, but at least for opportunities for people who would like to explore the subject and think about it before they commit themselves to a specific career or specialty within a profession, to be able to think. Because once you get into the profession, you're surrounded by all the pressures of real life, of bosses who want you to do this and that, and clients who expect this and that, and so it's if you're not prepared, if you haven't really thought about these questions, I know in the law it's very hard to stand up for principle against the wishes of a client unless you're very well prepared going in. And so I think there's an unfinished piece of business that in terms of educating for happiness that I think even our professional schools might fruitfully think about.
At the risk of letting a secret out of the bag, I think we've just learned another way in which you write a book, which is you're beginning to write about the professional schools in your new book, and I think we got a glimpse of something that you might be saying. Anyway, we're delighted to have people ask questions or make comments. If you would tell us who you are and keep it relatively brief, and anything you want to bring up, and you can direct it to either or both Sissela and Derek.
So we should be rather brief when we answer.
Please.
Thank you very much. Maybe now I'm on. Thank you very much. It's fascinating. I'm Jim Berkman. I'm head of Boston University Academy, so I've been educating for many years. I've used your book online in English classes. I was an undergraduate at Harvard and at the law school. It's a whole different subject. But clearly your marriage is a metaphor for this subject. And it's been delightful to watch you as point and counterpoint back and forth, representing all the shapes and colors of the spectrum that happiness has to involve, including the very internal, imaginative, humanistic, genetic, temperamental, and then the civic and larger social and statistical sides of it. But playing off the example in Bhutan where you had a benevolent ruler who decided that happiness was an important priority, and rather than the individual doing it from the bottom up or the government doing it from the top down, it was the unique example of the individual doing it from the top down and chipping away over 30 years. In our society, how would you say at this point in time we should be directing our energies? Should it be towards the individual imaginative internal process, or should our energies first be going to the external larger policy questions, or have to do both? But if you were advising young people individuals in this room who want to work on this for our culture, American in the 21st century, where would you put your energies?
Oh, I'd hate to choose between the two because I think, policy is clearly important in the sense that a lot of things that governments do affect people's happiness. In fact, the quality of government itself is one of the significant lasting influences on happiness. And yet at the same time, there's a great deal to be said for something that was stated long, long ago by that wry English wit, Samuel Johnson. How small of all that human hearts endure, that part that laws or kings can cause or cure.
Here's another place where I disagree, actually.
So much of happiness does depend on individual choices and particularly personal relationships, which governments really cannot affect very much. They can do something, but one's personal relationships, one's friendships, one's relationships with other people are primarily something one has to think about and develop and make choices about oneself. So that I think you really have to give at least equal attention both to the policy side, but also to doing whatever you can to help people think productively about how they can achieve happiness in their own life. And I'd hate to neglect one in favor of the other.
And I'll just add a small thing. I think if you watch young people, very often they are trying to deal with both sides, aren't they? For instance, young married people, they're thinking about, their own children perhaps, their lives, they're definitely thinking about the environment, what's going to happen in the next 10 years, 20 years. They are thinking on all the levels, if they can.
I take it, Derek, that one of the things you were saying, though, is that often young people project forward without having a lot of data on which to do it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
and
that's right.
one of the things which
That's right.
many of us are interested in here is, including the questioners, how can we make them more informed about those choices. Okay, I think I'm going to try to go from one mic to the next, which is a suggestion about traffic over here.
Now, this may get us into the whole thing that Derek didn't necessarily want to talk about, current academic.
I'm not going to talk about whether people are less happy or more happy today than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But more or less, what do we know about the happiness of people who take up teaching as a career? Actually, they do pretty well. Particularly professors with tenure score quite high on happiness and satisfaction with life, and they should score even higher than they do, because where else would they pay you to read? I mean, that's you have an enormous amount of freedom. You can write about what you want. You can have a good deal of freedom in what you teach. You're doing something that matters and is clearly worthwhile if you go about it conscientiously. So there are all the ingredients, and of course, there are a lot of driven people, and it may be that what you read about in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, about the professor of philosophy who was the father, who was a professor, and this wonderful way that Virginia Woolf has of explaining what was going on in the professor's mind. he was trying to get, she had a feeling that you work your way through the alphabet and you achieve greatness if you can get to the end. He was trying to get to P. And it was beginning to cross his mind that he was never going to get to P. And it was marvelous the way she described the kind of inner torment that he could not achieve as much as he hoped. So I suppose there is that, and perhaps one should learn to make one's peace with the fact that not everyone is going to be Einstein. But on the whole, I think not just teaching in universities, teachers, including special ed teachers, who would have much to be sad about, I think, in some ways, are among the happiest of vocations, much more so than businessmen, for example, more so than lawyers or doctors. So all of you are in the right school, and you have a jolly time in front of you. But I'm sorry, I'm sorry if you run across a lot of unhappy professors. I think that hasn't been my experience, I must say. I have met, I count as one of the blessings I've had in life of working in an environment where, there an unusually high proportion of really decent people who I think are really engaged by what they're doing, both teaching and research. And I've always counted it as a privilege to have worked in that environment and known so many of them. But you've had more recent experience than I, so I will keep my eyes open and look for unhappy professors and try to figure out why.
Yeah. I think I might have a comment here, which is I think those of us who are professors often don't project how much we love what we're doing. I mean, my wife and I have talked about how, we're very busy, we have so much to do, and our kids and young people see that, and they say, what a terrible life, but in fact, we love what we're doing, but we don't wear it on our chest. So you might want to probe a bit if somebody looks miserable and say, are you miserable? What would you rather be doing? Sissela, do you want to?
No, I think I'll leave that one, yes.
In the introduction, the question was posed, what better motivator than happiness? Both of you give short shrift to unhappiness. In the politics of happiness, you, as you say, set aside people like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Beethoven, and many others. But there's a lot of valuable lessons to be learned from people like that, aren't there? If all the emphasis and attention is on happiness, don't we risk becoming what the great late C. Wright Mills once referred to as cheerful robots?
I think that, if I can answer that one, yes, I think that is a very important point. And in my book, I definitely bring in melancholy people and sanguine people, so-called, and the tension that you mentioned Schopenhauer. He was a great genius, certainly one of the most miserable people.
Strindberg and Kierkegaard and people from your neck of the woods.
Yes,
too.
exactly, and so a great many others. But the more important thing to me also is that very often we can experience both, and we may move in our life cycles from one thing to another, but even at the same time sometimes we can be extremely happy about one aspect of life and quite miserable about something else that we know is threatening or going on. And so I was especially happy for my book to have the cover of my book, which is taken from Turner, the 19th century artist. There's a painting called Sunrise and Sea Monsters. The sunrise is on the front, sea monsters on the back. And I was amazed that Yale University Press said they could actually do that. I was thrilled to have that. But I feel very strongly that it would be quite wrong, as you say, somehow just to focus on cheerfulness and happiness. We have to see all of life as a whole and to manage nevertheless. And there, Montaigne is the person that means so much to me, who in the midst of war, he lived through terrible wars. The plague came through where he lived. He managed nevertheless also to be aware of all of that and to experience all kinds of happiness.
We have time, we'll ask, each of these folks can have a question, but since we want to keep our eye on the clock, we'll try to go briskly. Please.
Peter Prine, I'm a research assistant at the school. I'm wondering if you could share with us a few of the things that have brought you the most happiness.
Well, yes, I think that is a point, and certainly children, grandchildren, but more than that, I mean, you know, human beings in general, works of art, much of what we've talked about here. But that might take a long time, in fact, to go through, but it's good that you ask. One should think of that, and, you know, this is one of the aspects of people who write about happiness. One should actually think through. Some philosophers have suggested you should ask yourselves every evening, you know, what do I have to be happy about? What might I have done better? What am I really actually sorry about? There are all kinds of questions in one's own life to be asked.
I guess as far as I'm concerned, certainly one thing would dominate everything else, and that is, you know, other people, and particularly my family, my children, my grandchildren. I think they've been the greatest source of happiness. One thing I would add, just very briefly, that I found in doing my research when I saw these two kinds of ways of measuring happiness. How satisfied are you with your life was one, a more reflective question. And the other one is, what are you doing this moment and how do you feel about it? And are you happy doing it or unhappy? And that was very helpful to me because I always wondered why so many people came and asked me when I was president of Harvard, are you happy doing this unusual job? And I was always confused, and I didn't understand why I had so much trouble answering them until I read this research, and then I realized, yes, it all falls into place. I mean, there are different aspects of happiness. If you ask me, am I happy at a lot of moments during the day, I would say no. I mean, there's always some crisis going on, or students are yelling at you, or something's gone wrong, or some scandal has occurred, or you've made some silly mistake and can't figure out how to, you know, set things right, and it's embarrassing. On the other hand, I was always enormously satisfied with my position. I thought, I'm really lucky beyond any reasonable expectation. I'm doing something that really matters in an institution I really care about, and I'm able to, you know, certainly can't do everything that you want. It's a rather ambiguous position, but you can affect it if you're patient and you keep at it, working at the things you know will make the institution better. Mm-hmm. So at the same time, I could say, God, I'm nervous and often frustrated or unhappy or bored a lot of the time, but I'm enormously grateful and happy for having the chance to do this. So it just shows that happiness is not a sort of unitary concept. It has different aspects to it, and you can, depending on exactly how the question is put, you may have a different answer.
Hi, thank you both. My name is Spring Greeny. I'm a recent graduate of the college. It feels like, at least in my academic and personal experience, like there's this advent of self-help books, of happiness as a topic for economists to worry themselves with, for scientists and psychologists to look at. It feels like it's becoming a topic for experts to give advice to lay people on. And I wonder what you think of that. Do you agree that that's a trend emerging in recent years? And if so, if it's becoming more of an expert-driven topic, do you find that a positive development or something that may be troubling, have troubling implications? Well,
you know, I would say you're quite right. I mean, I would say not only expert-driven, it's an industry. Apparently, it's an $11 billion industry. Fascinating. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, it's even more important to be the one exploring, to be the one noticing how often those people disagree with one another, and not to be caught up. You have to be very careful, in fact, not to be taken in by the first or the second or the third of all of these ways you're supposed to get happy. So it's very important there. You are a traveler in a world where there are many messages coming at you, and you want to have some healthy skepticism and to notice all the differences.
To which I would only add that I think one always has to remember that this is a young discipline and no one is too expert in it. And the people who are expert, once again, are only talking about averages, generalities, correlations, not always clear about the causation. The question of what will make you happy or what is making you unhappy remains an intensely individual question. An expert may be able to ask a couple of questions or give some suggested things to think about, but never be able to answer that question for you. It remains an individual enterprise to be explored individually, and I think that's a good thing, because I think that must be, if there's any purpose to our being here, part of it must be that one has to explore these matters for oneself, and one can't simply follow cookbook advice from someone who's studied the subject.
Thank you.
Last question.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Nina Tang. I'm a student at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I actually spent my time this summer in Bhutan working for the Gross National Happiness Commission. So I really appreciated your...
And it's a miserable place.
Supposedly I'm supposed to be a happiness officer. It's a big joke there, but my work this summer comprised of actually trying to measure happiness in all the development programs and policies that the government does. Mm-hmm. And of course in policy making, it's important to ask, what do the people want? So we actually kind of did, my job was doing that. And there were a section of people who had no idea what I was talking about. What is gross national happiness? They're not sure. But what I learned, and before going there, I thought happiness would be just like kind of the things that I've been hearing people ask. Are you happy now? Are you happy today? What makes you sad? Happiness there is closely entwined with their religion. So it's a predominantly Buddhist culture. So actually what I found looking at it from a foreigner perspective is that the way they define happiness, particularly how they're trying to measure it in the government now, is directly aligned with all the Buddhist principles of compassion, good karma, balance, and then, for instance, they measure time use. In some of our policies, we have to make sure that, for instance, if we're advocating an entrepreneurship program or even education, we take time use into account, and it's something that some of the Scandinavian countries already kind of do in their policies, but it's an interesting perspective, it seems like, and I'm just wondering if you came across this insight as well, and because I think it makes a profound difference in just defining happiness in that way, and then kind of how a lot of the Western research I've been looking at defines happiness as well.
Mm-hmm. It's very good. It's very good if you ask that question about how you define happiness, but then you should also look, as perhaps you have, at all the very different ways. And there I came to the conclusion that it's so important to look at the different definitions and then to look at the people giving the definitions. And to me, it was almost like a Rorschach test. You take all kinds of philosophers, they have all these different definitions, tells you a lot about them, or in your case, it can tell you about the culture also. So that is all to the good, I think, to be aware of that and to think, this is not the only definition.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, it's great that we have some data from the front. Thank you. Usually I like to cut off speeches, but in this particular case it was very, very relevant. I want to quash the rumor that Sissela and Derek are starting a business called Bach and Bach Happiness, where Sissela will give individual counseling and Derek will counsel the government. That's not true. But what is true is that we've had, I think, a wonderful evening. Derek and Sissela and Derek have given the people in their own lives personally a lot of happiness, and through their writings and through their example, much broader kinds of happiness, and a word which we haven't used tonight, but again, I think it's very appropriate for both of them, much wisdom. So please join me in thanking them.
Thank you very much. That's so kind.